All right, we'll get going with the second hour, and I actually want to point you guys to our, maybe if it comes up, just thinking about it. My computer's processing. Okay, I want to point you to our website. I know several people were interested in some of the information. Where does it come from? We have all of this heavily documented and footnoted on our website. We also are all over social media. There's a few resources I will point you to that I think could be helpful for you. One of them you might have heard about, you might know about, it's a Founder's Bible. We promote, every Christian needs to be more familiar with the Bible. And you don't probably need more Bibles. I have so many, it's ridiculous. But one of the things unique about this Bible is in this Bible, it actually, every time the founding fathers mentioned how a specific verse shaped what they were doing with institutions or policies or government or whatever it was, we try to take that quote and put it right by that verse. And so it's filled with literally thousands of quotes and references from the founding fathers about how the Bible actually impacted and shaped America. It's also on digital form, so you can get that on any smart device. And we have all kinds of other stuff. There's some fun apps. We have our newest book is called This Precarious Moment. And I actually do think it's one of the most relevant and well-written books we've ever done. There are 6 issues we look at culturally. Specifically, what does the Bible say? What's historically true and accurate? And what do we need to do to help resolve some of those problems in culture? So I would point you to that. I think it's very good. We're also all over social media. There's a lot we do posting videos on social media. And so we'll do short tidbits about a founding father or about this day in history or whatever the case might be. Sometimes even cultural stuff, looking at what's going on. So with Judge Kavanaugh, why does it matter? And so a lot of stuff, if you want to follow us on social media, a lot of good stuff there. But I want to start this hour with a couple verses from Jesus. Jesus said in John 14:6, "And I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." First, let me point out the second sentence. When he says, "No one comes to the Father except through me," that is a claim of exclusivity. Currently, the majority of Christians in America believe that you can get to heaven apart from Jesus because they believe God's a loving God, and a loving God wouldn't send you to hell. Our theology is so stinking poor in America as Christians, obviously, as you were here at Charis, right, learning to think biblically, knowing what the Bible says, and so you can go and help equip and train and disciple people so they will think biblically. But here's an area we have to get to. They don't understand the exclusivity claim of Jesus, that he's the only way to heaven, he's the only way to the Father. And let me also point out the first sentence. He says, "I am the way, I am the truth, and the life." We live in a culture who no longer knows what truth is. Right? We don't even know the difference between a boy and a girl anymore. We don't know truth. And in the midst of this culture of not knowing truth now, a lot of people think that subjective morality, right? Whatever I believe, whatever I feel, whatever I think, that's what's true. Well, you can believe what you want and I believe what I want. We have a major problem understanding truth. And the reason this matters, the reason I think that truth is the biggest thing we have to defend as Christians, not even the truth of the gospel at the beginning, just truth in general. Because if there is no truth in general, then there can be no Jesus who brings truth. Right? And what does truth actually do for us in our life? Jesus said in John 8:32, "Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." You cannot be set free from a truth that you do not know or does not exist. Truth has to exist or there cannot be freedom. Right? So as Christians, we need to know what is true, and this is pertinent not just on a spiritual or theological realm. This is realistic for culture. One of the verses in Proverbs that I think is actually very telling for this, Proverbs 18:17, it says, "He that is first in his own cause seems just until his neighbor comes and searches them out." The first one to speak sounds maybe smart and sounds good. Oh, okay, maybe that's true. Maybe that's what happened. And that's the reason in a court of law you have a cross-examination, right? But every kid understands the principle here, right? There was a reason when every time a kids have a fight, there's a race to get to mom and dad first, right? Because I have to let you know about my brother who is the spawn of the devil himself. And so any evil that happened in this household was not me, it was him, right? Like that's what kids do until the cross-examination comes and it's like, oh yeah, it was my bad too, okay? What happens in America is so often something is posted on social media. The news outlets run with the story. Somebody says something and people go, "Oh my gosh, did you hear that?" How do you know it's true? We believe so much nonsense these days. And so one of the things I want to encourage us to do is I call this section Fake History or Pursuing Truth. Because there's so much things that people say that are just not historically accurate. And so one of the things I appreciate about President Trump is that he has done this hashtag fake news thing. And not to discredit, right, all the news outlets and sources, but it's made people recognize that not everything people say is true. Right? So how do we determine what is fake and what is true? Let me give you some practical things that I think will help you in your life and especially in your mentoring and discipling of the next generation. Okay, there are 4 questions we should always ask anytime anybody says anything ever. The first question you always should ask is, how do you know? My mom showed me a meme on Facebook earlier this week. She was like, did you know this? And I said, Mom, how do you know it's true? She said, oh, I don't. It's like, yeah, if we don't know it's true, we don't believe it. Okay, so for example, historically, people say, you know what, the founding fathers weren't religious. First question, how do you know? Right, I'm not being hostile, I'm not being confrontational, I just want to know. Because if you can show me actual historical evidence that they were not religious, I would believe you because it's true. I only have an agenda of truth. So if you can show me something I believe is wrong, I'll go, oh, okay, then I believe that because I care about truth. But a lot of times people make claims with no proof, which is why the second question is related to proof. What is your source? Right? Where did you get your information from? Well, I saw it on Facebook. Right? No, that doesn't count. I actually was leading a high school group, and we were doing a tour of Washington, D.C., and so on one night, we'd been there, I think it was Monday through Saturday, and on Wednesday night, we were doing a night tour of the monument. So we get on a bus, and on the bus, there's a tour guide, and he's explaining all these details. And so I've already had the kids for several days. We've already done a lot of the spiritual heritage of Washington, D.C., which is really amazing, by the way. So much cool stuff there. And so the tour guide, as we pull up to the Jefferson Memorial, he says, and this is Jefferson Memorial, and Jefferson is the one who gave us the famous separation of church and state to make sure we never have religion in government. Now, that's totally wrong, right? And I've actually already been with the kids long enough to explain some of these fallacies and actually show them the documentation of why it's wrong. So when he says this, all the kids know it's wrong, but in true kid form, I'm at the back of the bus and they all turned around and went, oh, and they looked at me and I was like, just play it cool, right? Like, take it easy. So I sent all the kids inside the memorial with their teachers, with their different guardians. And I told them that there's 5 inscriptions, go read them, then I'll come in and explain where those were written and who wrote them to, etc. But go read it. So I made sure I was the last person off the bus. So I went to the tour guide, and so one of the things that I think is very strategic is anytime you're going to question somebody, you never want to question from a position of authority, you question from a position of a student. Because I'm just trying to learn. Right? You are so smart. You help me know truth, okay? I'm just going to ask you questions. So I said, sir, I'm leading this group of kids, and I've heard people talk about the separation of church and state a lot, but I've never been able to find where Jefferson wrote that. Can you tell me where that's from? Now, I know exactly where it's from, but I'm trying to figure something out. In life, you only deal with 2 kinds of people, intentional and ignorant. Right? Either they know they're wrong and they don't care, or they don't know they're wrong. So I'm trying to figure, who am I dealing with, right? Do you not know what you're talking about, or are you intentionally deceiving people? So I said, sir, where can I find this? He said, oh, well, Jefferson wrote that in the Declaration. I said, actually, sir, we read the Declaration before we came and it wasn't in there. He said, really? I said, yeah. He said, okay. He thought for a second and said, it's in the Constitution. Jefferson was in Europe when the Constitution was written. Had nothing to do with the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, none of it, okay? So I said, well, actually, sir, we read the Constitution before we came too, and it wasn't in there either. He said, oh, I bet it's in the Bill of Rights. Which, if you don't know, those are amendments to the Constitution, so technically they're part of the Constitution. And I said, well, sir, actually, I read the Bill of Rights too, and it wasn't in there. And he got perplexed. He said, I got it. It's in the memorial. There's 5 inscriptions. It's one of the inscriptions. I said, oh, this is awesome. I said, hey, would you come in and I'll gather all the kids around and you can show them where it is? I'm setting him up. I know it's not there. He said, well, I'm not supposed to leave the bus. I said, sir, don't worry, I'm going to find it. Thank you so much. So I go in the memorial and I gather the kids around. I say, okay, so this one's from the Declaration. That's the notes of the state of Virginia. That one's of Benjamin Franklin. So I explain all the details. We then go to get back on the bus and I make sure I'm the last person on the bus. The tour guide is standing at the door of the bus and he sees me waiting and he lowers his head and starts shaking his head. It was awesome. So I said, sir, we read all 5 inscriptions and it wasn't there. Do you have any other idea where I can find that phrase? For the first time, he was honest. He said, son, I have no idea where Jefferson wrote that. This is just what they want me to say. I said, oh, so you actually don't know what you're talking about. I said, don't worry, I'll Google it tonight. Right now, that was strategic. Because that obviously it's not a time to be like, okay, sir, I'm kidding, I'm really smart, let me tell you where it came from, right? Like that's not gonna work. But I said, let me Google it tonight, because I thought, let me plant the seed, because if he Googles it, it's easy to find that letter on Google, and if you read the letter, the actual letter where Jefferson wrote the separation of church and state, he wrote it saying the government can never interfere with the church. The church is protected by an eternal wall of separation of church and state. Has nothing to do with the government being secular, has everything to do with the government staying out of the church's business, okay? But when you start asking people, how do you know what you're saying is true? You find out, are you basing it on facts or are you making stuff up? Here's the next question, what is the context? Because if this tour guide had told me, well, Jefferson actually wrote separation of church and state in a letter, well, he did. But what's the context of the letter? Because it's the exact opposite of what you're telling me, and context does matter. Do you know in the Bible, one of the things that God said is that he would lift up your skirt and show your nakedness to the world? God said that about you. Oh, well, I mean, maybe not you specifically. It was actually about the judgment that he was going to bring against the people opposing him. That was part of the destruction. If you take things out of context, they don't mean what they actually mean in context. Context matters, right? Certainly something you're learning at Bible college, right? Take the gospel in context. What does it mean? Why is Paul writing them? What's he writing about? But this is why context matters. But here's another thing. Okay, is that all he said about the issue? And let me just keep picking on Jefferson. Do you know at the end of Jefferson's life, Jefferson wrote a letter where he said that reading through the epistles is like searching through a dunghill trying to find a diamond. He was not impressed with Paul, okay? But that's pretty plain. But here's why it matters. Because people will often use Jefferson as the example and say, well, Jefferson wrote these several negative things about Christianity. Well, it's true. Here's my question. How many letters did Jefferson write? Over 19,000 that are in known existence. How many of those dealt with religion? 600. Of those 600, how many of those letters did Jefferson write something negative against Christianity or specifically against the doctrines of Christianity? It's about 24. And when did he write them? In the last 8 years of his life, and mostly between him and John Adams. So even John Adams wrote some negative things against doctrines of Christianity between him and Jefferson. Both of them were in the last 8 years of their life. Why does that matter? Billy Graham died earlier this year. Billy Graham was 99, he was almost 100. Billy Graham had not spoken at a public crusade since he was roughly 80 years old. There was a few short recorded segments, but he did not give any more live public appearances. Do you know why? His son would not let him. Franklin said no. Franklin actually in an interview said why he would not let his dad speak in public. He said, I'm afraid my dad will say something in his old age and people will use it to discredit his entire life's ministry. That's true. They would have. Right? That's a lot of wisdom from Franklin. It's a lot of wisdom. So I think it's a little ironic that the only thing you can point to that they said negatively is what they said in the end of their life. Nobody walks into a nursing home and goes, okay, did you hear that? Their entire life is meaningless. We would never do that. Now, it's possible that John Adams and Jefferson at the end of their life were completely coherent, logical, well-thought guys. Maybe. But that's not the only thing they wrote. What happened to the more than 500 letters that Jefferson wrote where he praised Christianity or the Bible? Why don't we study those too? And this is where in culture, a lot of times people only want to promote what benefits their side, not what's actually true and a good representation of reality. Right? So sometimes the facts aren't even entirely wrong. It's just you're presenting them in a dishonest manner. Right? So let me give you some bonus questions that we encourage people to ask. Are they making generalizations or giving specific examples? All the founding fathers were racist. Really, which ones? All of them. Really? Can you name the ones you know that were racist? Well, they all were. If you cannot give me specific examples, it tells me you do not know what you're talking about. Right? This is the problem. Okay, here's another question. Are the people they're quoting consistent with the other founding fathers? The most quoted individual by secular groups attacking America is Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine is the most anti-Christian of all the founding fathers. Now, he believed that there was a God that created the universe. He believed God was involved, but he hated Christianity. He hated the Bible, thought it was stupid. Here's what's significant. There's 250 founding fathers. They quote one. Did the other 249 believe the same thing? If you can't show me quotes where they confirm that, you can't tell me they all believe the same thing. Just because you have one example doesn't, right? I mean, you understand the flaw in that logic, right? In this room, I probably could find one crazy person. Don't point. Right? I mean, understand, like even in a court of law, if you came and said, I have one example and they're all guilty, that's not how that's a terrible argument, but this is what we do historically, even with America. Here's the last one. Do those quotes contradict other times in their lives? Okay? So yes, John Adams at the end of his life did say some things attacking the doctrines of Christianity. But that contradicts everything else he did the rest of his life. And so let me take just some of those thoughts, and I'm going to take practical things from history that people have certain beliefs about, and I want to show you kind of the other side of the story, where sometimes some of the claims they make are partially true, sometimes they're totally false. But if you don't know the rest of the story, you don't know, and here's why this matters. We have to learn to start asking questions in pursuit of truth. Okay? Jesus, in his ministry, always asked questions. Okay? If you're not familiar with the gospel, go read the Gospels. Every time Jesus asks questions, make note of it. You'll find more than 300 times in the Gospels where Jesus asked questions. Questions help us discover what people are thinking, where their information comes from, and ultimately what is true. As a Christian, I want to believe what is true. Truth is what I want to base my life on. So if you're going to make a claim or accusation, then I want to know, is that true or not? So let me just start with something that is a very common thing taught in most universities today. The founding fathers were all racist, bigoted slaveholders. Okay, how many people have heard this accusation or claim? I would assume most of us, if not all of us, okay? So let me just start. So whenever I get a chance to speak to young people, and I do periodically get to speak on college campuses, and when I do, I love talking about some of these issues and topics, and so I'll show a picture of, this is the depiction of the signers of the Declaration. So I'll show this picture and I'll say, okay, how many founding fathers can you name that were slave owners? The very first person to say is Thomas Jefferson. Who else do you know that had slaves? George Washington did not sign the Declaration, but he was a founding father. So if we want to include the guys who did the Constitution, there were 90 framers of the Bill of Rights, there were early governors, there were early generals, there's 250 founding fathers. So now we have Jefferson and George Washington. You have 248 left. All of them, right? That's what they say. Here's the problem. You only know 2 people that had slaves, and therefore you label them all as guilty? That's obviously some flaw in your logic, but if you don't know any of the others, you don't know what's wrong. And that's what happens today. We don't know the other guys. For example, if you look at somebody like Benjamin Franklin and Benjamin Rush, in 1773, they started an abolition movement to end slavery in all of America. In fact, in 74, they actually started this organization, and the organization was the very first one in the colonies. The reason they started the organization to end and abolish slavery is because actually both of them, at the time, each of them had a couple slaves. And actually, Benjamin Rush was a Christian. And one of his slaves had died. And he had a vision where this slave came back and explained to him the horrors of slavery, how it made him feel, the oppression. And Benjamin Rush said he woke up in a cold sweat. And he said, I knew I had to free my slaves. He says, so I went to free my slaves. At the time, we're still under the king. When he freed his slaves, he was told by the appointed official from the king that you are not allowed to arbitrarily free slaves, because part of the practice is slavery, and you cannot just arbitrarily free your slaves. He says, well, I want to. Benjamin Franklin had a similar encounter. As Benjamin Franklin was arguing for the freedom of America, it occurred to him the hypocrisy to say, I want to be free myself, and yet I've enslaved people. He said, I can't fight for my freedom if I can't free people that I have enslaved. So he says, I need to free them. So these two guys start working together in Pennsylvania, and they try to free them, and they're not allowed to, but they try to get the other colonies on board. We need to end slavery in America. In fact, Benjamin Rush takes this, he actually tries to make it a national colony or a national movement in all 13 colonies to end and abolish slavery in America. Then Benjamin Franklin actually joins with Francis Hopkinson, and they start schools specifically to educate blacks in America. Why does that matter? Because under the king, it was illegal to train blacks. Why? Because the king believed it's easier to enslave an ignorant people. It's true. America's a pretty poor example even today of how ignorant we are, and we believe terrible things, right? These two guys said, we don't care if it's illegal. We are starting schools just to educate blacks, and they did. And by the way, Stephen Hopkins was a Quaker. His hat is what signifies he was a Quaker. Quakers were always anti-slavery, always. Two things Quakers hated were war and slavery. That's consistent for all of them. The Quakers actually had tried in their early colonies in the 1600s in America, 1680 and 1690, they outlawed slavery in their colonies until the governor appointed by the king told them, you're not allowed to keep people out of your colony just because they have slaves. Which for the Quakers, that's very much part of their religious belief system. But Stephen Hopkins is the governor of Rhode Island. He signed a law in 1773 outlawing the slave trade and trying to limit slavery, saying it's wrong, we need to end it. That law was vetoed by the king. In 1776, when we separated from the king, their state assembly met. They brought the exact same law back to his desk. He signed it. They were the very first state to sign an anti-slavery law, and they did it within 1 month after the Declaration. All 8 northern colonies had passed anti-slavery laws before we even got to the Constitution. See, we forget, like even in the idea of slavery, there was a difference even in sentiment between many of the North and the South. Jefferson, in his original draft of the Declaration, he actually included an anti-slavery clause, an entire paragraph against slavery, and there were 2 states, South Carolina and Georgia. Actually, North Carolina kind of joined on board, so arguably 3, but 2 led the movement, and they said, we aren't trying to end slavery, and the Declaration was going to be unanimous. John Hancock said that everything has to be unanimous or we won't do it. Benjamin Franklin said, surely we must all hang together or certainly we will all hang separately. So either we're in this together or we're not going to be able to do it. Well, so there were 3 states who said, no, we're trying to maintain slavery. They were all southern states. Even back then, there was different sentiments between the North and South, even among the founding fathers, and we kind of forget that today. Well, let me point to another guy. This is John Witherspoon. He was the president of Princeton University. He was a pastor, and at the time he was a pastor, he was the president of Princeton University. He trained more founding fathers than any single other individual. He actually brought the very first black man to come be actually an assistant teacher at Princeton, which not only did he believe in educating blacks, he believed in putting blacks in position of authority, which at the time was unheard of. Literally unheard of. Okay, that's not the culture they were in back then. However, that's what he did at that time. William Ellery, he along with Rufus King are the 2 guys who wrote the Northwest Land Ordinance, which says that no new state can enter the Union if they are a slave-holding state, because he was anti-slavery, said we don't need more slaves in America. You have people like James Wilson, who he's the guy in the Constitution, it actually banned the slave trade by 1808. It's actually in the Constitution. He's the guy that got it in there. He argued that slavery was a violation of the laws of nature, because you study nature and nothing else enslaves anything else, only humans. That's how we know it's wrong. Because if God intended slavery to be real, animals would enslave other animals. God didn't do that, so slavery must be wrong. He made this argument. He got it in the Constitution. The reason this matters is because today we hear about the few people who we could argue maybe were racist, that they did have slaves, and not the many that didn't. Of the 56 signers of the Declaration, 41 of them at some point in their life did have slaves. What is never talked about is how many of them freed slaves and then began working against slavery. Right? Yeah. Go back to the hymn Amazing Grace. Right? Written by a guy, one of the worst slavers there was, and God woke him up to realize how evil what he had done was, and it had a total change of heart. This is not that different for some of the founding fathers. The problem is today, we don't even know them. In fact, I had an argument with a professor one time, and he said that one of the reasons America is evil is because we had slavery. I said, well, that's interesting. I said, so you would equate evil, right, or a slavery to a nation being evil. So the standard is a nation is evil if they have slaves. I said, let me ask this question. Can you name a nation in their entire existence that never had slaves? And he couldn't. I said, or can you name a people that at some point were not enslaved or enslaved somebody else? And he couldn't. Because slavery is the history of humanity. It's not the history of the Anglos. Right? It's the history of the world. It's not the history of America. And by the way, why did slavery end in America? Because Christians stood up and said, we need to stop what we're doing. Now, there were Christians on the other side too, right? But that's no different than today. There are Christians arguing against abortion, Christians arguing for abortion, right? The ones arguing for it, you're wrong. Okay? But it's Christians who apply the Bible nonetheless. We make this generalization, all the founding fathers are racist. No, that's fake news. Some of them were racist. All of them were not. And actually, I was at a college one time and I heard this generalization, well, all the founding fathers are racist. They all had slaves. I said, really? I said, so Sam Adams was racist and had slaves? All of them were. I said, really? Because Sam Adams, he never had slaves and he was always against slavery. Well, maybe not Sam Adams, but all the others. I said, really? So John Adams, he was racist and had slaves? Well, I don't know. Yeah, because he didn't. Well, okay, so maybe not Sam Adams or John Adams. I said, okay, so what about Francis Hopkinson? And I start listing all the people I know that never had slaves and were always against slavery, right? The problem is we don't know enough to know what's true and not true. And so we believe things that are not true because I saw it on the internet. Well, a professor said it, right? Well, it was on Fox News. It was on CNN. That's not validation, right? This is why I love the Bereans so much, right? Because Paul is teaching them the gospel and they're like, hold up, somebody go with the scroll. We don't believe this dude, right? Until they had verified it, they would not believe. Okay, the principle as a Christian, it's okay to trust people, but verify, right? Even if it's your pastor, right? You verify because you are accountable to God for your belief, no matter who informs you of that belief, right? Let me give you another thought, okay? We stole land from the Indians. This is a huge accusation today. So here are the questions I want to know. First of all, who stole land from the Indians? Because I didn't. Okay? So who is the we, and which Indians did we steal land from? And were they the first Indians to possess that land? How did they get the land? Oh, they conquered the other Indian tribes. Well, how did they get the land? Oh, they conquered the tribe before them. Oh, how did they get the land? They conquered the tribe. They were a conquest people, okay? So this is actually significant. Now, was the land stolen from Indians? There's no doubt. American history, there's no doubt there were evil people that did evil things. But there's more to the story. So let me back up and give context, because the argument is the very first settlers, the very first people that came here stole from the Indians. Who did? Because there were two colonies, Jamestown and Plymouth, and they both had different relations with the Indians. Jamestown's was much worse. Plymouth had the longest lasting peace treaty between any Anglos and any Native Americans. It was more than 40 years it lasted. It was violated by the Indians when the Indians went on the warpath. Okay? The reason I can point out how foolish this argument is to say the Pilgrims stole land from the Indians, the first Thanksgiving, there were 51 Pilgrims, and that included the men, women, and children. There were King Massasoit and 90 of his Indian braves that came. You're telling me that 51 Pilgrims with men, women, and children who stole from the Indians then invited the Indians to come have a feast where the Indians outnumbered them 2-1, and they were all men, and they couldn't get their land back. That is stupid. So when did we start stealing land? Because when the Reverend Thomas Hooker founded Connecticut, he didn't steal land because he actually got there. The king had said, you can go there, I own the land. He got there and there were Indians. And so he said, well, I can't steal. He said, hey, can I buy some land so I can build here? They said, sure. He bought land from the Indians at a price set by the Indians. He did not steal from them. You have the Reverend Roger Williams, who was the founder of Rhode Island. He bought the land from the Indians at a price set by the Indians. You have the Reverend William Penn. He actually didn't just buy the land from the Indians. He started building because the king, right, owed it to his father, and the king said, you can have all this land. He starts building, and the first tribe comes to him and says, hey, this is our land. He says, I'm so sorry, I didn't know. Can I buy it from you? They said, yes, you can buy it from us. He paid the first tribe. Second tribe comes to him. Says, what are you doing? This is our land. He says, I'm sorry, I thought it was theirs, and we bought it, but it's yours. Oh, okay. Can I buy it from you? He bought it from a second tribe at a price set by the Indians. A third tribe came to him, because all three tribes were warring over that land because they all wanted it for their hunting land. So he bought it from three tribes at a price set by all three tribes. Now, one of the arguments people make today is, yeah, but back then, right, Indians didn't know land value. Here's the problem. It is impossible to cheat somebody in a free market. It's impossible. because you cannot coerce them to buy something they don't want. If at the end of the exchange, everybody is happy, right? Then nobody's cheated. Now, we also could talk about the fact Indians did not believe in private property the way we do today because they were nomad people. They moved, and so they were like, you want to pay us to stay? Okay, right? The Pilgrims were like, okay, so what do you want for it? We'll take that axe and that blanket, and they're like, you want an axe and blanket? Okay, quick, get the axe and blanket. Both sides arguably thought they were getting the best end of the deal. Both sides, okay? The very first Indian wars that came actually came because when the new settlers were building, the Indians as a nomad people didn't realize that these whites were gonna build and never leave. They didn't get it. So what happened is the kids and grandkids are like, that used to be our hunting ground, let's go take it back, let's kill them. And so they went on the warpath to try to eliminate the people living in what used to be their ancestral hunting grounds and ancestral land, okay? That is not, again, stealing because the land was purchased. Again, argument, they didn't really know what that was, but nonetheless, the land was purchased, so you can't say they stole it from them. And this is where it's even interesting going forward to the founding era. The founding fathers didn't even believe it was appropriate to take land from the Indians. This is from the Northwest Land Ordinance. Article 3 deals with the Indians. The utmost good faith shall always be observed towards the Indians. Their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent. It was against the law to steal from the Indians. Now, did it still happen? Well, of course, right? It's like saying murder's against the law. Does murder still happen? Of course. There were evil people who did evil things. But the history of our nation has not been a history of just evil, which is what a lot of people argue today. No, by the way, at our museum, when we have original documents, we have a lot of original Indian land deeds. This is from 1728 for 7,500 acres. This is from 1769. It's from New York, 300,000 acres. That's a pretty big farm. Right? That's a lot of land. This next one is my favorite because the Indians only title it to the white woman. They say, we give the white woman land. By the way, her name was Mary Jemison. It's who they sold the land to. Here's what's significant. You have a woman who was a landowner. I thought women didn't have any rights in early America, right? We have some conflict when you start studying history. Now, when did the abuse of the Indians actually start happening in America? It largely happened under and after Andrew Jackson. That's largely when the great abuses happened, right? This is when you had the Trail of Tears. This is when so much of this happened was largely under Andrew Jackson, but that's not the founding of our nation. And it's worth noting, it was not just these cavalry guys, Americans, who were killing the Indians. Both sides were pretty bad, right? Both sides were pretty bad. There were some tribes who were really not good tribes and who did some really terrible things. But nonetheless, this idea that we stole all the land from the Indians, that's nonsense. Was land stolen? Yes. Did that happen at times? Yes. Were there evil people who did evil things? Yes. But that's not the history of our nation. The history of our nation actually is we had better relations, by and large, than really anywhere else in the world, and especially from the Christian community. Let me give you another one. We stole land from the Mexicans. Being in Texas, this is really a fun one for me to talk about because it allows me to talk about, right, the Alamo. But let me before we get to the Alamo, so Mexico owned all of what was yellow, okay, 1830s. This is the map from the 1830s. They own all of that. At the time, Texas was actually part of Mexico and was glad to be part of Mexico. The problem was at the Alamo is this from the Texas, well, the War for Independence from Texas, right? On top of it, there's a flag flying. It's 1824. Now, the Alamo happens in 1836. So why are they flying an 1824 flag? And this is historically documented, well documented, everybody knows this. They're flying that because a constitution was written in 1824 that gave rights to the people. The problem was there was a new leader in town, Santa Anna. Santa Anna said, I don't care what the Constitution says, I am in charge and you will do what I say. He started going to the homes and confiscating their guns, confiscating whatever he thought was of value. He would take their cows, he would take their horses, and the people got very frustrated. The people that were living in Tejas, right, Texas, they said, we've had enough of this, and so they began fighting a war for independence. There were many Americans who came to join them because they said, we know what oppression felt like, we will help defend you. Right? So they fight this at the Alamo, this happens. Well, Texas wins her independence in 1836. 1845 is when she enters the Union. Texas was her own sovereign nation for 9 years. Here's my question. How did we steal land from you that you hadn't owned for the previous 9 years? right? This sounds just like a jealous boyfriend coming back. Being like, no, that's mine, you can't have it. Dude, she broke up with you, leave her alone. Right, like this, and so one of the arguments too, and that's just Texas, right? But one of the arguments is, well, yeah, what about all the other land that Mexico owned? Okay, so in 1848, when Texas actually leaves, Mexico starts a war. And because they don't want to lose Texas, because at this point they've kind of left them alone, but we still think we own them. So as this war breaks out, this is when we go and fight, and we actually have pushed them all the way down to Mexico City before they finally surrender. When they surrender 1848, we give them all the land back except Texas, because that's what was part of our union. We gave them all the land back. Mexico, however, is in great debt. And Mexico, trying to pay off the debt, actually says, hey, you guys want to buy some land? We'll give you a good deal. We bought most of what the rest of we have in America for $15 million. So here's another question. How did we steal land if we paid you $15 million for it? This is where, if you just know basic history, right, these claims become utter nonsense. And yet in colleges today, this is what students are being taught about how evil America is, because we were always oppressive and we always abused and we always stole and we were no good. And that's why the founding fathers were evil, and that's why we have to get rid of the Constitution. In fact, it's not only the founding fathers. The new accusations that have exploded is Christopher Columbus was evil. In fact, in Texas, Austin, Texas, our state capital, they replaced Columbus Day. The last 2 years, they celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day. Okay, so here's my question. Which indigenous people are we going to celebrate? Because even though there were some amazing Indians who are worthy of honor, there's a lot who weren't. Right? So to paint a broad brush, let's celebrate them all. The reason the Texas Rangers came into existence was because the Comanches were murdering, raping, and scalping everybody they could catch within a 500-mile radius. Sometimes, actually, they would go from Colorado all the way to Mexico City. They could make a 500-mile ride in just a couple of days. They were amazing once they got on horses and could do things, right? The reason Texas Rangers existed was to stop the slaughter the Indians were doing to other people. And it is worth noting, do you know how the Comanches were defeated? It actually wasn't by the cavalry necessarily. There were 15 other tribes that joined the cavalry to help go against the Comanche, because the Comanche were killing so many other Indians too. And they said, oh, can we come with you guys? Like, you have boom boom sticks, like we'd like to play with y'all. So if we can come. But here's what's interesting, right? So we're saying, no, Columbus was evil and all indigenous people were good is the accusation. So let me, and if you're not familiar, these are articles and headlines that have run over the last year or two, just with accusations against Columbus and how evil he is. This is on college campuses. This is what they're being told. This is why on college campuses, they are destroying these monuments. They're going and they're painting his hands, his face with blood, because they're saying, right, he has blood on his hands. He's he's an evil guy. They're really just even tearing them down on some occasions. And so there are 600 statues to Columbus in America. Because it used to be we recognize he's somebody worthy of honor. Today, we don't think he's worthy of honor. And even though this is bad, on some level, that's kind of impressive. If you can get a hatchet stuck in a statue, like that was a good swing. Right? Like I'm not saying it was good, but that's good muscle. Okay? So here's the question. Columbus is largely accused of being someone who brought oppression to America, oppression to the Native Americans, and there's a lot more accusations today, but why do we think he did this? And the accusations kind of fall into two categories, but one of the biographers of Columbus, Washington Irving, back in 1828, he wrote one of the most famous biographies. Here's what he said, even back then defending Columbus. He said, there's a certain meddlesome spirit which in the garb of learned research goes prying about the traces of history, casting down its monuments and marring and mutilating its fairest trophies. Care should be taken to vindicate great names from such pernicious erudition. It defeats one of the most salutary purposes of history, that of furnishing examples of what human genius and laudable enterprise may accomplish. His point was that people are always going to attack the heroes and try to villainize them. He says, but you have to be ready to defend against these pernicious attacks, right? These spurious attacks that are just fraudulent, right? They make them up. You have to defend them or you will lose them from history. Now, he said that in 1828, but this is still true today. Today, people largely believe that Columbus was a guy who promoted slavery and committed genocide against the Indians. The problem is we know so little about Columbus today, we don't know if in fact he was a thug, right? And if he was a thug, then maybe we shouldn't celebrate him, Or was he in fact what for hundreds of years Americans thought he was in fact a hero and a very courageous person? If you go back to Columbus, what do most people know? There's only one fact people really know about Columbus, right? It's in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. That's pretty much what we know about Columbus, okay? But here's my question. If Columbus committed genocide, if he promoted slavery, when did he do it? Because he took 4 voyages. So which voyage did he do it on? Or was it all 4? We don't even know he took 4 voyages for the most part, right? And these 4 voyages, and this was actually kind of impressive that he was able to navigate so well and find different places. And so each time he landed different, but was able to get back where he wanted to go. But in these voyages, the first voyage was actually a voyage of discovery. And this at a time when there was Muslim wars going on in Europe and Asia. And so there was trade route over to the Indies, over in Indonesia and Japan and places where they're trying to get over to do trade. The Muslims are not letting anybody go through that's not Muslim. So we found a route where you could sail around Africa and you could come up. And Columbus said, well, instead of sailing that far, he said, we're a globe. Why don't I just sail around? Now, we thought it was a very small globe, so his math was not very good. But he said, why don't I just sail around and I'll get there? So he sails around. Well, this first one was for a voyage and discovery. There were 3 ships, right? The Nina Pina and Santa Maria. As they go, he lands here. When he lands, he meets the Taino tribe. They're part of the Arawak language group. But the Taino tribe is the first tribe he meets. He actually writes back to Ferdinand and Isabella and says how amazing these Indians were. Here's part of his letter. He says, your highnesses may believe there is no better nor gentler people in the world. Your highnesses ought to rejoice that they will soon become Christian and that they will be taught the good customs of your kingdom. A better race there cannot be. Now, if he says a better race there cannot be, I think you're going to have a hard time convincing me he was a racist outright because he saw different races that these people are amazing. Now, that was his first voyage. When they leave the first voyage, actually 2 of their ships have problems, and so 2 ships can't go back, so they have to leave actually part of their men on one of the islands, and they build a fort, and they're going to be safe. His second voyage was a voyage actually of colonization. They did not have 3 ships. They actually had 17 ships and almost 2,000 men that went. Of those 2,000 men, they were not all good guys. Because a lot of them said, wait a second, let's go over there. We can find gold, right? We can find things we can do. And so this was their pursuit. When Columbus gets back, they go and they look for the men they left on the island. And the fort was burned down. Most of the bodies were gone, but there were a few bodies on the ground. But the bodies looked like they'd been picked over by animals. Their eyes were missing, right? Some of their flesh was gone. And the Taino Indians came up. And Columbus is like, what's the deal? What happened to my men? And they said, well, remember when you were here last and we told you there was a second Indian tribe? They came and they killed them. Columbus is like, what? He says, well, what happened to their bodies? And they said, well, they ate them too. The Caribs, or where we get the name Caribbean, the Caribs were also called the Cannibs, which is where we get the name cannibal. Columbus says, people don't eat people. The chief said, no, they really do. They eat people. He says, I don't believe it. But his men have been conquered. They've been killed. They've been murdered. So he says, okay, let's go find this group. So the Tainos join him and a group of his men, and they go and they find one of these Carib villages. And they conquer the village, but in the village there were 50 huts. Inside the huts, actually one of his men wrote about this. Let me just read you part of what his man said. As soon as these women learned that we abhor such kind of people because of their evil practice of eating human flesh, they felt delighted. They well knew that they were safe in our company. Now, what happened is they got there, and in those 50 huts, they found women. And so this is not over. I'm going to read the rest in a second. They found women filling those huts. They got the women out, and they said, hey, where are the men? Where are the children? And they said they ate them. And they said, okay, so why didn't they eat you? And they said, well, they keep us alive because we produce babies for them to eat. They were a breeding farm. Okay? So Columbus is appalled by this, right? So he actually frees those women, and this is the rest. These captive women told us that the Carib men used them with such cruelty as would scarcely be believed, and that they eat the children which they bear to them. This is on official record from the men who were there. Okay? So this tribe wasn't very good, which, by the way, the only time Columbus ever gets accused of genocide was of this Indian tribe. The only time he's accused of slavery is when they finally were able to capture some of these men. He actually allowed his men to enslave some of these Indians. It's also worth noting, back at this era of history, early 1500s, late 1400s, the era of conquest, there's only three options. You either kill the conquered, you enslave the conquered, or if you were some of the Indian tribes, you eat the conquered, right? Columbus allowed some of those men to enslave them, but understand perspective. Like this is the conquest era of world history too, right? But this is the second journey. Well, this is also depictions from the Carib Indians and actually from some of those Indian tribes even throughout world history of what they believed in their cannibalistic practices. Cannibalism was not unusual for world history for many Indians. We think that's vile. People wouldn't do that. No, they actually did that. Okay? These are actual drawings from many of those tribes where they would sacrifice human bodies to the gods and then they would eat the bodies. Okay? So pretty appalling stuff. His third voyage, he goes over and he is the governor. Now, by the way, some of the men under Columbus did commit terrible atrocities. Columbus tried to stop their atrocities. When Columbus tried to stop them, the men got angry. They actually imprisoned Columbus, threw him in jail. Those men then wrote back and asked the king to send them a new leader because Columbus was being so much trouble. He was causing all these problems. So Columbus is in prison and he is going back to go on trial before the king and queen for all the accusations against him. As he goes before the king and queen, this is one of the letters he writes. But God is above, who with so much wisdom and power rescued Daniel and the three children, and who, if he please, can rescue me with similar manifestation of his power. So he believed, right, I am innocent in this, right? Just like the Hebrew children, just like Daniel, I've done nothing wrong, and yet I'm in prison. He goes before the king and queen, and they're like, Chris, what did you do? And he explains, it wasn't me. I actually was on a 5-month voyage when all these atrocities happened. I got back and found the men doing it. I told them not to. They got angry at me for trying to stop them. They imprisoned me, and then they accused me of the very things they were doing. The king and queen vindicated him of every wrongdoing and said, you're fine. You're not the one that did it. The men who were under you, they're the ones who did it. He then goes on his fourth voyage, his last voyage. It was a quick voyage. He comes back, and he actually dies shortly after. One of the guys who actually was considered the greatest biographer of him was Morrison. And here's how Morrison described the majority of Columbus's life when it came to the New World. Here's what he said. He was a man alone with God against human stupidity and depravity, against greedy conquistadors, cowardly seamen, even against nature and the sea. The things that Columbus gets accused of are because people don't know what actually happened, or they're accusing him of the atrocities his men actually did that he got thrown in prison for when he tried to stop his men, right? They committed a revolt. But again, this is where when you start studying history, guys, there's no doubt. Columbus was not a perfect man, right? No, Columbus was a sinner in need of a savior just like all of us. I'm not going to defend the dude that he never did anything wrong, but I will defend him against the false accusations, and that's mostly what happens today. Right? People don't accuse him of being a sinful human being who needs a savior. They accuse him of being an evil villain who he was not. And this is where, as we start looking at what we hear in culture, right, at the things that are being said, we need to learn to start asking questions and determine what actually is truth, right? We cannot just believe something because we read it on the internet. We cannot just believe it because our friend told us. Be people that pursue truth. One of the greatest encouragements at a Bible college, learn to be Bereans. Be people that, you know what, here's the thing. I love Andrew. I think he's a man of God, anointed. I think he's doing things that I wish there were more of Andrew in the world. But here's what I can tell you. Andrew is not Jesus. So just because Andrew said it doesn't mean I automatically believe it. I'm going to look it up in the Bible. Now, it just so happens he knows the Bible really well, so pretty much what he says is right there in the Bible, right? However, it would be foolish of us to blindly accept something just because of the source or just because of who said it. No. Pursue truth. We have a culture that doesn't know what truth is anymore, right? We don't know what's fake. We don't know what's true. We don't even know boy and girl anymore, right? We need to be people in a quest to pursue and identify truth. Guys, I want to see the world come to know Jesus and learn to live the life God's called them to live. But if truth doesn't exist, you can't convince them Jesus is real and they need a savior. You have to defend truth, or Jesus doesn't really matter that much for most of the world in their eyes. Defend truth, but that means you have to be people that pursue truth and know truth. And that means even in culture, we have to be willing to defend truth. If you have kids in school, right? Engage in what they're doing. Know what they're learning, because they're learning all kinds of nonsense. Be people that study God's word and pursue truth in all that we do. Thank you guys so much for letting me share with you guys. Yeah.